determined to humiliate the heavy-set waitress in front of the entire dining room. The city's most feared crime boss barked a cruel insult in a language he was certain she couldn't understand. He expected her to flinch. He expected tears, or at least confusion. Instead, she smiled, leaned in, and answered him flawlessly, in the same forgotten tongue. She had just made a very dangerous mistake. The air inside the copper wren always smelled like seared butter, old money, and quiet fear. Tucked into a converted townhouse on a narrow, gas lamp-lined street in Boston's Beacon Hill. It was the kind of restaurant where reservations were booked 4 months out, and a tasting menu ran $900 a head before wine. It was also a place obsessed with appearances, which made Rosalind Kessler an anomaly among its staff. At 5'7" and 265 pounds, Rosalind did not fit the aesthetic the owners had built the restaurant around. The other servers, mostly students and part-time models who took the job for the tips and the proximity to money, moved through the dining room like they'd been poured there. All long limbs and practiced smiles. Rosalind moved like a woman who had spent years learning how to be overlooked. She wore a slate-grey uniform that was always slightly too snug across her shoulders. Her dark hair pulled into a tight, unglamorous bun, and she carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who had decided, long ago, that flinching only invited more cruelty. Her manager, a nervous, sharp-tongued man named Walter Sims, kept her on staff for exactly 3 reasons. She had memorized the entire menu and wine list down to the vintage. She could handle the restaurant's most miserable customers without losing her composure, and she rarely called out sick. He did not keep her around out of kindness. Table 9 sent back the halibut. Walter hissed, cornering her near the espresso machine one Thursday evening, looking her up and down the way he always did, like she was an expense he hadn't approved. Fix it, and tuck in your shirt. Rosalind, you're straining the seams again. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. Yes, Mr. Sims. She smoothed her apron and walked back into the dining room, her feet already aching in her orthopedic shoes. She was used to the whispers, used to the wealthy patrons who looked past her entirely, or, worse, to looked at her the way you'd look at a stain on an otherwise perfect tablecloth. To them, she was simply the heavy waitress who didn't belong in the glossy fantasy they were paying $900 to inhabit for an evening. Rosalind didn't care about their fantasy. She was 31 years old, carrying $150,000 in medical debt from her mother's 4-year fight with leukemia, and the tips at the Wren were the only thing standing between her and an eviction notice. She kept her head down, refilled water glasses, and survived until that Thursday night at exactly 9:45 p.m. The restaurant's heavy oak doors swung open, and the low murmur of the dining room dropped to nothing. The host stiffened mid-sentence. The bartender's hand froze over a half-shaken cocktail. Even the hedge fund managers at the corner table seemed to hold their breath. Victor Rusnak had arrived. Victor was not a man who showed up in tabloids or society pages, but his name moved through the city's underground like a current, quiet, constant, and dangerous to touch. He was the head of the Rusnak organization, a vast criminal network that controlled freight yards along the eastern seaboard, 3 off-book casinos, and a growing stranglehold on shipping routes across the North Atlantic. He was 41, built like a man who still trained every morning, wore a navy Brioni suit that likely cost more than Rosalind's car. Behind him walked two men who moved with the coiled, watchful energy of professional violence. Walter nearly tripped over his own polished shoes rushing to greet them. Mr. Rusnak, an honor. Sir, your table is ready. Victor didn't so much as glance at him. He gave a small, dismissive flick of two fingers and walked toward the private alcove at the back of the restaurant, sealed off by heavy curtains, the color of dried wine. Who's taking the Rusnak table? Walter demanded a moment later, bursting into the kitchen, sweat already darkening his collar. The staff scattered like startled birds. Not me, whispered Denise, a blonde server who'd worked the floor with Rosalind for 2 years and was the closest thing she had to a friend at the Wren. Last time his crew was in, one of them broke a glass just to watch the busboy jump. Walter's frantic gaze landed on Rosalind. A slow, opportunistic smile crossed his face. If something went wrong tonight, he needed someone he wouldn't mind losing. Rosalind, you're on the Rusnak table. Her stomach dropped. Mr. Zims. They usually request Denise. I don't care what they usually request. He shoved a heavy tray into her hands. Take them the 2012 Barolo Reserva and get their order. Don't bump into anything. If you embarrass this restaurant in front of Victor Rusnak, you will never work in this city again. She took a slow breath, steadied the tray, and pushed through the swinging doors. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what Walter was doing, throwing the expendable one to the wolves. A man like Victor Rusnak expected beauty, perfection, and silence. Rosalind could only offer him one of those, and it wasn't going to be enough. As she approached the alcove, she could hear low, clipped voices discussing things that belonged nowhere near a dinner table. She paused for half a second, straightened her spine, and stepped inside. The alcove smelled of good cologne and the faint ghost of an illegal cigar. Victor sat at the head of the booth, scanning the leather-bound menu with total boredom. To his left sat Bogdan, older, thick-necked, a scar tracing his jaw. To his right sat Milo, younger, restless-eyed, always watching for a reason to move. Good evening. Gentlemen, I have the Barolo Reserva. May I pour? Victor didn't look up. He simply tapped the rim of his glass once with a manicured finger. Rosalind moved efficiently, uncorking the bottle, pouring the precise measure into his glass. As she leaned across to pour for Bogdan, the edge of her apron brushed the table barely. A whisper of fabric, and in the tight silence of the alcove, it might as well have been a gunshot. Milo smirked, leaning back. Careful there. Sweetheart, table's bolted down. But I wouldn't test it. Heat crawled up Rosalind's neck. She said nothing, finishing the pour with steady hands. Are we ready to order? Or would you like a few more minutes? That was when Victor looked up. His eyes were dark, flat, entirely without warmth. He studied her plain face, her heavy frame, the cheap fabric of her uniform, and something cruel and amused thawed the boredom out of his expression. He'd spent the day untangling a shipping dispute that was costing his family a fortune, and he was, at that moment, in the mood to be entertained at someone else's expense. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The Rusnak family's most valuable off-book shipping route ran through Douglas Harbor. On the Isle of Man, a small, windswept island in the middle of the Irish Sea with an outsized grip on North Atlantic freight registry. For 5 weeks, Victor had been negotiating with the Cregeen brothers, local fixers who controlled the Peel docks and refused to conduct business in anything but their native tongue, an ancient, nearly extinct Celtic language that almost no one outside the island still spoke fluently. Victor looked Rosalind dead in the eye and spoke, fluently and rapidly, in Manx Gaelic. Da me shikir daifil. Oh, he orly in Eris, yen thibe show. I'm sure you eat all the profits of this restaurant. Bring me your best steak. But don't touch it with those fat hands of yours. Pig, Bogdan, and Milo, who caught only a handful of crude words, understood the tone well enough. They laughed low in their throats, the ugly, complicit laughter of men enjoying a joke made at someone else's expense. Someone who couldn't possibly understand. Rosalind went perfectly still. The tray in her hands suddenly felt twice as heavy. What Victor Rusnak did not know, what no one in Boston knew, was that Rosalind Kessler had not always been a waitress with an ordinary Midwestern name and an ordinary Midwestern face. Before the medical debt, before the weight gain that came from years of chronic stress and a thyroid that had never fully recovered from it, before her mother's death emptied out whatever was left of her life, Rosalind had grown up as the daughter of Thomas Kessler, an intelligence analyst who had spent 7 years posted under diplomatic cover near Douglas Harbor, working for a quiet corner of the Defense Intelligence Agency that didn't officially exist. She had spent 16 years of her life moving between safe houses scattered across the Irish Sea. She'd attended a small international school outside Peel. Manx wasn't a language she'd merely studied. It was the language she'd once dreamed in, hearing it now. In a Boston dining room, over a wine list. Nearly knocked the breath out of her. The shock lasted less than 2 seconds before it curdled into something hotter, sharper. She had swallowed abuse all night. She had swallowed it for years. But she was not going to stand there in her too tight uniform and be called a pig by a man in an $11,000 suit. The laughter died down. Victor waved a hand and switched back to English with a bored sigh. She doesn't understand. Just bring the... Rosalind didn't blink. She shifted her weight, looked directly into the coldest eyes she'd ever seen in a human face, and answered in flawless, upper register, Manx. The kind spoken in the harbor towns where the old island families still gathered. Dan el ein fierfi. My chune sire. Ach da, mes moinatun du veldite ummerke nu sagurtach na dug harre. Our meat is excellent. Sir, but I think your manners are cheaper than your suit. Then, in English, she added, I'll bring your food. But if you speak to me like that again, I will pour this wine over your head. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. Bogdan's jaw dropped. Milo looked around, utterly lost, sensing only that the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Victor Rusnak stopped breathing. His eyes widened, genuine, undisguised shock, as he stared at the overweight waitress, like she'd just pulled a gun on him. The Manx she'd spoken wasn't just correct. It carried the exact upper-crust inflection of the old Douglas families, the kind that took generations to acquire and couldn't be faked for 10 unbearable seconds. No one at the table moved. Rosalind realized, with a sudden and sickening clarity, exactly what she'd just done. She had threatened Victor Rusnak in his own private negotiating language. In front of 2 of his men, her heart slammed against her ribs. but she refused to look away. She lifted her chin and waited for whatever came next. And then Viktor Rusnak smiled. It wasn't the mocking smile from a moment ago. It was genuine and far more terrifying for it. "Well," he murmured in English. His voice, a low, gravel-edged baritone. "I believe I owe you an apology. Mado, tell me, how does a waitress in Boston learn to threaten a man in the tongue of Peel Harbor?" Rosalind gripped her tray until her knuckles whitened. "I read a lot. Sir, now will you be having the ribeye? Or would you prefer a few minutes to consult a dictionary?" Milo shot to his feet, hand twitching toward the inside of his jacket. "You fat little sit down." "Milo." Victor's voice cracked like a whip without ever rising in volume. Milo dropped back into his seat, glaring murder at Rosalind, who didn't so much as glance at him. Victor picked up his wineglass, took a slow sip, his eyes tracking every micro-expression on her face. "The ribeye. Medium rare." He glanced at her name tag. "And Rosalind, you will be the only one serving this table tonight. If anyone else brings my food, I'll send it back untouched." "Understood." She swallowed hard. The full weight of the danger she'd just invited into her life, finally landing. "Understood, sir." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Spine straight, knees shaking violently beneath her uniform. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire way. She thought she'd defended herself. She thought she'd won some small, private victory for her own dignity. What she didn't yet understand was that Viktor Rusnak wasn't embarrassed. He was fascinated. And in his world, becoming the object of a boss's fascination was infinitely more dangerous than being the punchline of his joke. The kitchen was its usual chaos of clanging pans and shouted tickets. But to Rosalind, it all sounded distant. Muffled beneath the roar of her own pulse, she leaned against the steel counter, waiting for the ribeye to rest, trying to remember how to breathe normally. Walter appeared at her elbow, face blotchy with fury. "What did you do?" he hissed, grabbing her arm. Bogdan came to the bar for a scotch and said, "You threatened Mr. Rusnak. Are you out of your mind? You're a waitress. You're supposed to be furniture." Rosalind pulled her arm free. "I handled the table. Exactly like you told me to. You're finished." Walter spat, his face turning an unflattering shade of purple. "The second they leave, to clean out your locker, I will not have some overweight insubordinate order up." "Table 9, the head chef bellowed, and Rosalind didn't wait to hear the rest. She hoisted the tray and pushed back into the dining room, ignoring the sting of Walter's words, the way she'd learned to ignore most things. The atmosphere at the alcove had shifted. Bogdan and Milo sat rigid, nursing their drinks in near silence. Viktor, by contrast, looked completely at ease, scrolling through a phone with an encrypted lock screen until Rosalind stepped into the light of the booth, and his eyes locked onto her, like a searchlight finding its target. She set the plates down with mechanical precision, steam curling off the seared beef, mingling with his cologne. "Mr. Sims looked upset." Victor observed mildly, picking up his steak knife. "Mr. Sims is naturally an anxious man." "Sir," Rosalind replied, keeping her eyes on the table. "Did he fire you?" "That's between me and my employer." Victor cut a precise slice of the ribeye, chewed, swallowed, dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, and then, without breaking eye contact, switched back into Manx. Manachur Ema. U. Chawim. In Tibe. Sure. Asvarims fusdag Glenny Medun. If he fires you, I'll buy this restaurant and have him wash the dishes. Rosalind's breath caught. She fought the reflex, but a small, involuntary smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth before she could stop it. Victor caught it instantly. He leaned closer, close enough that the air between them seemed to hum. What's your name? Really? He asked, softly. In English, Rosalind Kessler. She said. He tilted his head. Kessler. A very plain name for a woman who speaks the harbour dialect of Peel like she was born there. You didn't learn that from a textbook. You learned it near the water on Chan. Maybe. Or closer to Douglas. You have the southern inflection. A cold bead of sweat traced her spine. He was too observant by half. Her father had operated near Douglas Harbour for 7 years before the agency pulled him out, and the money, and eventually the man himself, disappeared, leaving her with nothing but the language, the instincts, and a mountain of medical bills from her mother's illness. Enjoy your meal, Mr. Rushnok, she said stiffly, and turned away before he could ask anything else. For the rest of the night, he watched her. He watched the way the wealthy patrons of the Wren looked through her like glass. He watched the barely concealed disdain from women in 5-figure gowns as their eyes swept over her frame. And he watched the way she carried all of it, every slight, every whisper like armor she'd forged herself, piece by piece. Over years, Victor lived in a world built entirely of beautiful, treacherous people who would sell out their own families for a taste of his power. Rosalind was something else entirely. A fortress, unflinching, brutally honest, and hiding a razor's edge beneath an ill-fitting apron. When the Rusnak party finally rose to leave at 1:20 inches the morning, the entire restaurant exhaled as one organism. Walter scurried over to grovel at the alcove's edge, bowing so low it was almost comical. I trust everything was to your satisfaction, Mr. Rushnok, he said, and I do apologize for any unpleasantness with your server. She's no longer employed here. Victor stopped Mr. He turned his head slowly toward Walter, his eyes going flat and reptilian. Is that so? Yes. Sir. Terminated. Effective. Immediately. Walter said it proudly. Catastrophically misreading the room, Victor reached into his jacket, pulled out a heavy money clip, and peeled off 25 crisp $100 bills, letting them fall onto the white tablecloth. That's for the steak. Then he stepped directly into Walter's personal space. Walter was taller by several inches, but he suddenly looked very small. Rosalind Kessler was the only competent thing in this entire gilded box. Victor said, his voice dropping to something lethal and quiet. If I find out you've withheld $1 of her final paycheck, I'll have Milo pay a visit to your place in Dorchester. Do we understand each other? Walter turned the color of old paper. Yes. Yes. Mr. Rushnok. Victor walked out without another word, leaving his manager trembling under the candlelight. When Rosalind came back to clear the table, she found the $2,500 in cash. Tucked beneath his half-empty wine glass was a heavy, embossed business card. On the back, written in careful black ink, was an address on Newbury Street and a single sentence in Manx. Tamelakal Koran Agvel Aglak. I need a voice that isn't afraid. 2 days later. A thick August heat pressed down over Boston. Rosalind stood on Newbury Street, looking up at a glass-fronted high-rise cutting into a grey sky. She was unemployed. Her checking account was overdrawn by $65, and her landlord had taped a final eviction notice to her apartment door in Dorchester the morning before. The paper curling at the edges in the humidity. She'd called her Aunt Delia the night before, the only family she had left, and gotten a long, tired sigh and an offer of a pull-out couch in Providence that both of them knew wasn't a real solution. Denise had come by with a bottle of cheap wine and sat with her on the fire escape until midnight, saying almost nothing, just being present, which was its own kind of gift. You're not actually thinking about going, are you? Denise had asked, watching her turn the embossed card over and over in her hands. I don't have a lot of other doors open right now. Rosalind admitted. He's a mobster. Russ. He's the only person in this city who's looked at me and seen something other than a problem to be managed. Denise hadn't had an answer for that. Now, standing on the side
in her best navy blazer,
the one that disguised her broad frame and a simple black dress. Rosalind felt entirely out of place, walking into the marble lobby and approaching the private security desk. I have a meeting, she told the guard. Sliding Victor's card across the polished stone counter, his eyes flicked up, then widened slightly. He swiped a keycard and escorted her to a private elevator that shot straight up to the penthouse without a single stop. When the doors opened, she stepped into a sprawling, minimalist apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. A massive dark wood conference table dominated the room, buried under blueprints, shipping manifests, and a graveyard of empty espresso cups. Victor stood at the window in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. He turned as she entered and dismissed the two armed men by the door with a single nod. You came, he said, walking toward her. I need a job, Rosalind said bluntly, refusing to let him see how unsteady she felt. And you didn't leave that card out of charity. What do you want? His mouth curved. Straight to the point. I like that. Sit. Please. She stayed standing. I prefer to stand. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving past the physical bulk the whole city had spent years judging her for, and landing instead on the steel underneath it. For the past month, he began, arms folding. My family has been trying to lock down a shipping corridor through Douglas Harbor. It's the most strategically valuable port in the Irish Sea. We're negotiating with the Cregeen brothers, local fixers who control the Peel docks. I know the Cregeen name. Rosalind interrupted. They run half the black market moving through Peel. Ruthless. And they hate outsiders. Something flickered in Victor's eyes. Genuine surprise. Exactly. And they refuse to speak English at the table. They say things to each other in the old dialect, right in front of my men, knowing my translators only catch the formal, textbook version. He crossed to a leather briefcase, opened it, and dropped a thick dossier onto the table. My men are getting outplayed, and millions of dollars are sitting rotten in shipping containers because of it. I need someone who understands the street version, the threats hidden inside polite phrases, the cultural weight behind a single word choice. He paused. But more than that, I need someone who won't freeze the moment a gun comes out. The way you looked at me at the Wren. You've been around dangerous men before, haven't you? Rosalind looked down at the dossier. Her father's face surfaced in her mind, the late-night departures, the sudden relocations, the faint smell of gun oil clinging to his coat when he finally came home. My father worked intelligence, she said quietly. I know how this game is played. Then play it with me. Victor's voice dropped, low and magnetic. I have a video call with the Krigin brothers in 20 minutes. Sit beside me. Tell me what they're really saying to each other. Tell me how to corner them. And what do I get out of this? He stepped closer. The scent of sandalwood surrounded her. He didn't look at her with Walter's disgust, or the pity of the Wren's wealthy patrons. He looked at her like she was the single most valuable thing in the room. I know about your mother's hospital bills. Rosalind, he said softly. I know you owe Massachusetts General $150,000. Help me secure this port today, and I'll wipe that debt clean by tomorrow morning. I'll also pay you $20,000 a week as my personal consultant. Her heart stopped. $150,000. 4 years of crushing, life-shaping debt. Gone. You investigated me, she accused, voice shaking between fury and a desperate, unwelcome hope. I never bring anyone into my house without knowing their ghosts first. Victor's tone stayed smooth, almost gentle. You've spent your whole life being underestimated because of how you look. Rosalind, people see your size, and they stop looking any further. I see exactly what you are. You're a weapon nobody bothered to notice was loaded. Let me put you to use. The elevator chimed somewhere behind them. Milo stepped in, glaring at Rosalind before turning to his boss. The Krigin feed is live. They're getting impatient. Victor didn't look away from her. So, Ms. Kessler, are you going back to serving overcooked halibut to people who won't remember your name? Or are you going to help me take a shipping port? Rosalind's gaze drifted to the glowing red light of the secure monitor across the room. She thought about Walter Sims sneering at her across the espresso machine. She thought about the eviction notice curling in the heat on her apartment door. Then she looked at Victor Rusnak, a criminal. By every reasonable definition, a dangerous man, and the only person in Boston who had ever actually seen her. Slowly, she reached up and unbuttoned her navy blazer. Folding it neatly over the back of a leather chair, she rolled her shoulders back and walked toward the monitor. "Tame koirt, lesh, un argid," she said, flawlessly. Let's make some money. Victor's dark eyes flared with something close to triumph, and something else beneath it, harder to name. He pulled out a chair for her and took his place at her side as the screen flickered to life, pulling Rosalind Kessler into a brutal, glittering underworld that, whether she'd known it or not, she'd spent her entire life training to survive. Did Rosalind make the right choice? Stepping into Victor Rusnak's dangerous orbit, or has she just signed away whatever piece she had left? The underworld doesn't forgive mistakes, and it never forgets a debt. But for the first time in years, Rosalind Kessler isn't afraid of being seen. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments below.